The internal loss of control of your data is pretty amazing, especially considering that it's like an internal organization. Then you start dealing with an EPC that's external to a solar developer, and that EPC might be using a different engineering firm to be able to do things like ground grading. Keeping track of everything is a real nightmare. And it's one of the biggest problems that our customers continue to talk to us about.
That is Douglas Geist, co-founder and chief commercial officer of PVcase. They surveyed over 400 solar professionals and found that teams run up to 12 tools per project. That fragmentation costs solar teams control over their data at every single handoff.
We did our own in-house research study last year amongst 400 plus industry professionals. And one of the things we were talking about is like, what does the tool set look like that you guys are working through, and how many different tools? So you mentioned 5. I think we heard like it could be anywhere between 6 and 10, maybe as high as 12 in some cases, just the different places.
He believes that good surveys prove why unified workflows protect margin before construction even begins. In this episode, you will learn why running up to 12 tools per project creates hidden data loss, why losing internal control costs teams days of work and duplicate effort, why collapsing a stack into one unified workflow protects margins, and how to blitzscale a company from Lithuania to dominate the global design software market globally. I'm Peter Pongratz, and this is Soliverse, the future of solar. Welcome to the show. Before we dive into PVcase itself, how did you end up in solar?
How did I get to solar? Solar is also, as I said before, kind of like my wife. Brought this to me through her Instagram account, actually. She became friends with David, the other co-founder, through Instagram because he was living in Germany and he was originally from Lithuania and was getting ready to come back and get married and was doing a lot of traveling back and forth because he was also starting his design consultancy business in the solar industry at the time. And was interested in, what's going on with restaurants here in Vilnius because, they were just transitioning to the euro. There was a lot of EU money coming into the country, restaurants popping open. None of them stayed open for very long. It was like 3-4 months. They closed down and something else would open up in its place. But there were lots of things. My wife was early adopter for Instagram, taking pictures of almost every meal that we ate out. And that all found its way to Instagram. And then David would ask her for recommendations. And so we eventually wound up meeting for drinks one night and immediately hit it off and became very good friends and did a bunch of traveling together. And as we would be traveling and kind of both working remotely, we would just start talking about our businesses and talk about, what we were doing and how that was. And, most of the work I had been doing at that time was consulting residential and commercial mortgage businesses in the US on sales and marketing, scaling their sales organizations, growing it, and utilizing kind of the same type of structure that, I think a lot of SaaS businesses have with sales development representatives and AEs. And, we basically got talking about that, and he wanted to scale his design consultancy business. And, engineering for me wasn't really very interesting. It's my background is in finance and insurance. Not so much insurance isn't that interesting either. But, as far as like engineering, I didn't really think that I wanted to sell engineering services. But then about a year later, I went to meet him at his office in Kaunas here in Lithuania. And he introduced me to his engineering team, and he sat me down with the engineers, and they showed me how to design a solar park. It was a disaster for me. Like literally taught me like how to do it. And then they showed me how they do it with this in-house tool they had been building, which eventually became PVcase and our ground mount product. So as soon as he started talking about like, we're not really thinking about scaling the engineering part of the business so much anymore. We're really thinking about scaling the software side of things. That became much more attractive and much more interesting. And so that's when, as they kind of had come together with like an MVP with the other co-founder, Adam, at that point I joined in order to be able to, scale the business. So that was my introduction to solar at that particular point. So I kind of got very, very, very deep into it very quickly because I just saw so much potential for the amount of time savings we were able to generate for the engineering team at Detra, which is David's other company. And it was great. So, and then it was a rocket ship.
True. It's fast forward 8 years. You guys are probably one of the most successful software companies in solar period, right? So, and you gave me I actually took so many notes here to go down different avenues as well. So you were in sales professionally from the get-go. So you were actually coincidentally meeting with David, and was the path kind of clear that this is meant to be built for scale, or you were testing the waters and seeing like, okay, if we spin it into like a SaaS company, is it going to be an easier scaling, obviously, than a consulting business, right?
So interestingly, as we started, like, as I said, scaling an engineering business wasn't very attractive for me. I had quite a few friends from university that had gone into various different software businesses, several of which had exits at some point. And, this was at the peak of SaaS in terms of like businesses just scaling and going crazy. And so, I had been following the successes of a number of my friends and fraternity brothers from university. And when David started talking about software, it was like that was the thing that immediately piqued my interest and said, like, if this is a real potential, this could be the thing that ultimately winds up being able to scale very quickly. You could take a business that's, a subscription business based in software with multiples that were going around, 8 and 10 years ago and 6 years ago. And, you could grow that business to a valuation significantly higher than you could a consulting business in the same period of time, simply because of how those two businesses are fundamentally different on how they get valued. And so, it became very clear very quick, also because, David's company was using it internally in order to be able to provide design services for several other companies within the solar industry, several of the biggest companies in the solar industry at that particular point in time. And some of the things that like those customers were asking questions on, like, the business, it's, you start doing a design. You never get the design right the first time. You never get the right module right the first time. There's always a need to change a design. There's always a need to redo something. There's always a new piece of information that comes into the equation at some point that you then have to make an adaptation and potentially, in some cases, start over from scratch. And so, as that became the case, his business would get a request to change a design. And, that used to take them 2 or 3 weeks to make the change. Now, all of a sudden, they're making those changes in like a day or two. And the customers are kind of curious. And so when the customers started getting curious, started talking to them about the software offering that we had internally, and they wanted to see it. They wanted to be able to get their hands on it. And so we kind of got very quick traction with companies that had been working with his design consultancy business in order to be able to start it, basically supporting some of their in-house engineering with the software as well. And so we got traction pretty quick.
That's a textbook startup success story, right? But I took some notes here on the side while you were talking. I could pick up on so many of these things, but you mentioned, the consulting versus the SaaS business, right? So on one hand, you have the kind of linear potential of growth, and on the other hand, you have the exponential. So that makes perfect sense. But if we look at SaaS and AutoCAD, right? So it's kind of related, but it's not the same thing. So like, how were the first discussions when it comes to AutoCAD first? So basically desktop-based software versus something that's already back in those days. The cloud was already, the kind of direction to go to. How did those discussions go?
From the sales side of things, it was a conversation. There was a lot of education that needed to go on in terms of educating the customer on what this was. Fortunately, I think at the time that we were really starting to engage in those conversations, AutoCAD had also been looking at shifting some of its pricing model as well, and they were changing some of their product in terms of it is still an install, but it wasn't the kind of install where, you would kind of have the one version and then upgrade at some point later on. They were trying to roll out more of a subscription-based model as well. And so while it was on-prem installed software, they were rolling over to more of a subscription type of a model And I think that ultimately kind of helped us out a little bit at that point in time because they were starting to get familiar with it. And there were also a lot of these other businesses, they were using other software also that was now already on on a subscription type of a model. So, they weren't happy. And I think, that helped our conversation somewhat during that time period. We still have companies that are like, is there an option to be able to buy it for life? Like, can we pay to buy it for life? And I'm like, I don't know if you're going to like that price. But yeah.
Always a possibility, but it's not rooted in commercial reality, I guess. So it makes sense. And you mentioned subscription and the subscription model. I wanted to double click on that because what you guys did is quite remarkable in the sense of creating a premium product or a premium market for that premium product in an extremely niche market, especially back in those days. Now the market is substantially larger, but was that intentional or was that part of the strategy back in those days already? Or
yeah, it was. I mean, there were other players in the market already, and where we learned very quickly, we had the ability to be able to win was on offering a product that was also somewhat of a service. And so, our product was being offered with the software plus all the training you could use as an engineer, all the support you could use as an engineer. And, at the time, some of the markets that we were dealing with, solar was not new, but the size of the projects was new. They were getting into these bigger and bigger and bigger projects. And so you're dealing with things like more complicated terrain, difficult like earth structures and things that were complicated. And so they were asking questions all the time. And so for us, this was an opportunity for us to set ourselves aside as kind of a SaaS business with some consulting, but the consulting wasn't charged as a separate service line item. It basically was all bundled together as the same. And so ultimately, this is the area that I think we really did well early on in terms of being able to deliver very quick support. I think most of our service tickets are answered in less than 5 minutes. Resolution is done in just a couple of hours at most. We're an engineering company. So like most of the team is engineers that are ultimately helping to facilitate that with experience having done solar projects before. So it's in this area that, it's kind of like we're an extension of our customers' internal teams. And so that's been the thing that, helped us be able to establish ourselves as a premium product. We were higher priced than anything else that was available on the market at that particular point in time, but you got more and what you got was better. So I think it was warranted.
Maybe it begs the next step of your evolution of the funding round, right? So you guys raised over $120 million plus so far across, 3 or 4 rounds by now. So that gives everybody can do the maths on the back of the napkin of what valuation that would add up to. But what was the main pitch towards the VCs? How did you guys manage to convince them that this market is, although especially back in those days, it was quite niche. Now it's gotten substantially bigger. What was the kind of value add that you guys managed to convince them over?
I mean, I think for us, I think it was the speed with which we were scaling. It was mirroring what the solar industry as a whole was doing. I mean, if you go back 8 and 10 years, solar was exploding. I was actually thinking about this the other day as, most of the markets around the world currently right now are struggling with being able to bring projects online because of grid concerns, because of bureaucratic concerns, things along those lines, government policies. And I think we may have helped create some of that bottleneck by enabling so many engineers and so many developers to be able to do designs and submit so many project applications to the queue that ultimately I think some of that bottleneck is probably somewhat enabled by the fact that, companies were able to scale so quickly as a solar developer. There are certainly projects that have been done over the last 6 or 7 years where 5 or 6 of our customers were working on submitting bids for the same exact project. And so, I think that was something that during the fundraising was evident already. And so, as it was kind of easy for us to be able to provide visibility into the growth path that we had, showing where we were still not penetrated, it became I wouldn't say it was a difficult process to be able to raise back then. I think if we were trying to do that today, I think we'd have a much harder problem today, especially with all of the bottlenecks that we're currently seeing. Also, I think development for solar development is also much more challenged today than it was back then in terms of being able to get projects funded, with all of the incentives that existed back then, with all of the tax credits that were available, interest rates certainly being lower at that particular point in time. Private equity, very large infrastructure funds just throwing money at solar development. Now they're still throwing money around, but they're throwing it now towards data center development, right? And so it's getting less attention into solar and it's more into data centers. But at some point, they're going to come back to the realization that they got to be able to power those things. And solar is, I think, we're seeing that already, especially in the US. We have a lot of customers in the US that are, traditionally solar developers that are dabbling now in data centers and looking now at co-locating those two things together in order to be able to get these things up and running online quicker, because they just can't get the grid capacity. So it would be a different story for us to have to raise today under those same conditions.
For sure. And I mean, as everybody can appreciate, the markets are always cyclical, right? So as you mentioned, a couple of macro items, as such as the interest rates, the political push or pull, it always changes the landscape. But of course, it's always better to be growing in a hot market, right? And the rising tide floats or lifts all boats. So and that's exactly what you guys did. And on the scaling side of things, so you guys started out of Lithuania, which is a tiny country from even inside of Europe. You scaled across Europe, and then now you are truly global. Like, how was the kind of first step into the US, for example? Because that's a major market for you guys as well, and it's a very different kind of mindset as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, we went to the US early, to be honest with you. We went to our first trade show, which was, RE Plus, before RE Plus was RE Plus, when it was SPI in Salt Lake City. And I want to say that was 98 or 99, not 98, 2018, 2019. And, I think being present at that show, this was so early that because we had built the product here in Europe, everything was in metric units. So we're at the trade show at SPI showing how to be able to do solar design with PVcase's ground mount product. And everybody's looking at it going, do you have this available in US units and imperial units? Or is it only going to be available in metric? So we came back from that trip immediately, and it was like myself and Adam sitting there going, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to be able to make sure that we back engineer all of this, and to be able to understand all the algorithms now need to be able to work in those units as well. So it was an interesting challenge. But, at that particular point in time, from the perspective of a sales conversation, there was no real difference. It was, everybody was having the same problems, right? Designs take a long time to ultimately be able to do. We're having to redo designs multiple different times. We need something that's going to be able to help us do this work faster and more accurate with less mistakes, so that we can actually just be able to get this stuff done in a much shorter period of time, because the demand was there and they just couldn't keep up with it. Early days, that was the case, and I think we've seen it become a bit more, I would say, segmented between the US and Europe, over the last couple of years. But, 6-8 years ago, I would say it was probably still the same.
Do you think that the design process has actually gotten more complex or less complex? Because on one hand, you have more tools to solve the problem, right? But on the other hand, the complexity has increased, right? Because we have larger sites, all the good and easy land is gone. So now you need to really go into terrain and, in the hillside as well. So what's your thoughts on this?
It's market by market, to be honest with you. Companies that are some of the companies that we deal with in the US that are doing, really big projects, it's flat land, right? It's flat land. Same thing in the Middle East, customers we deal with in the Middle East. It's the complexity there is simply just based on the size. It's not based on the design. The design's not really that complicated, to be honest with you. The bigger they are, the more they just look like a grid, and it's an easier design methodology, I believe, in order to be able to get those done. When we first started selling, like Germany was one of our first markets that we really went heavy in, and what you just said, all the good land is gone, all the flat land is gone. Like that's what we were hearing back then, right? And we just continue to hear it over and over and over again. Where things have gotten, I think, more complicated now is in the fact that you have to try to design these projects to be, multi-use is, I think, the term that, kind of most markets are currently using. So you got to be able to have some form of agri PV associated with it in some markets, or you got to be able to, satisfy some other condition in order to be able to get it approved. And I think that complexity is what makes it actually more complicated these days, rather than, simple things around like the type of land that you're ultimately on. And also restrictions in some areas in terms of certain markets not allowing any sort of, significant ground grading any longer. Like this is one of the areas that, companies were really, really looking for a solution that would be able to help them figure out, how to maximize the cost effectiveness of their ground grading on a project. And now you're looking at some markets where it's like not an option, so these are areas that, certain technologies like terrain following trackers are certainly helping in a lot of those cases where those are, appropriate for the market and for the geolocation. But I think it really depends on where the project is located, to be honest with you.
True. And I mean, it is getting more complex from a kind of permitting and grid connection perspective. But the actual design is not the bottleneck, right? The bottleneck right now is connecting to the grid, getting it approved, getting all the paperwork done, which is constantly changing as well. And from a European perspective, at least, it's we are trying to harmonize all those processes, but it's not going as fast as it should, right? And it's a clear indication that we saw last year, that first time there is a drop in installations in the last 10 years.
I know of one or two companies out there that are really, they're like stealth startups that are currently looking to solve this problem. I think that is like the next big opportunity, is really in that area of how do we ultimately wind up? And it's really at the government level that I think that this ultimately needs to have the impact, because business and capitalism, I think, is really good at getting from idea to cash as quickly as possible. It's all the hoops that have been put in front of us that we have to jump through in order to be able to get these projects approved, to get these projects connected. I've heard, in doing this for 8 years, I've heard some nightmare stories of, especially in the Australian market. Like 6-8 years ago, we were in Australia. We had a couple of customers that had built large projects and they never got connected. Never. Like, that's crazy.
But in Australia, it's a little bit different than in Europe and US, right? Because you can kind of live with it not being connected to the grid. So now, last week I just recorded another episode with a good friend of mine, Gavin, and he's focused on Australia, and he said, like, okay, the microgrids actually make much more sense because the population density is so low, and if you have a city or village is so concentrated that you can get by, But here in Europe, it's a very different situation, and in the US, it's something in between, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's true.
That's also an interesting way of framing that part. And you've touched on the sites already and the terrain itself. So you guys acquired Andersen Optimization about 2 years ago. Can you explain?
It's been 3 full years already.
3 years already. Okay, so then time flies by. But what was the main rationale behind? Was this always part of the strategy to integrate a site selection tool into PVcase's umbrella and create a continuous workflow, or was it just kind of a match made in heaven kind of situation?
So, I mean, it was, the vision for PVcase very quickly, after seeing the early success that we were having with the design tool, became to build kind of the end-to-end solar development platform. And so with that being the case, ultimately, it made sense for us to look earlier in the project lifecycle than the initial design. And so, to be honest with you, the acquisition came up, not that we were particularly looking for that at that particular point in time. This was a situation that the timing was just right. We were in engagement with Andersen, basically on an integration level. We were integrating with them in order to be able to reduce some of the friction that some of our customers and their customers are experiencing with bringing their files into PVcase as the starting point to do the design, in a way in which we were able to kind of better align the layers that they had in theirs with the layers that we have in ours. And so as we were working on that, we started to see that the teams really worked well together, and that there was an opportunity for us here to kind of be able to take this and do this now in order to be able to start moving earlier in the project lifecycle, in order to be able to help facilitate this. So it was an opportunity that we kind of jumped on at that particular point in time. It's one of the reasons that we did the acquisition, not the acquisition, but the fundraising at that particular time in order to be able to complete that transaction. And so, we were doing an acquisition and a fundraising at the same time, and it was kind of like opportunistic, so it wasn't really planned. Normally you do like a big planning and building up to be able to do a big fundraising. So this kind of all came together just kind of like all at once. So it was a stressful time. I would say it was averaging like 2-3 hours a night sleep for like 6 months during that entire time and during that entire process. A lot learned, but I think at the end, the net result has been great. So, we have really good customer overlap now. We have a good attach rate between customers that were theirs that are now using PVcase ground mount and vice versa. So at the end of the day, I think it's definitely been a success, and it's something that we would be looking to do more of that in the future.
Yeah, and it definitely pays off to be opportunistic when the time is right and the target is right as well, right? So on that note, are you guys looking into any particular areas or domains within solar for companies to potentially acquire, or what is the let's rephrase that question. What is the main growth strategy for the next 5 years for PVcase?
So, I mean, we are looking to continue to build out that vision of the end-to-end solar development platform. And so the area that we're currently focusing on right now is, if we think back to, you mentioned before, design isn't the tough part about getting a project approved or getting a project done these days. There's, numerous other reasons that cause that to fail, whether it be financing, whether it be bureaucratic nonsense with permitting, with grid connection, with any of those other things. And so those are the areas that we're currently most interested in kind of evaluating and looking into, and trying to help our customers be able to see higher levels of success on those projects with less wasted resources. So ultimately being able to bridge the gap between getting a project approval, like doing all of the permitting, doing all of the process, and actually wind up being able to get it approved. Now, there's a lot to unpack within that, especially considering that, like we mentioned before, like governments and bureaucracies are ultimately right now the biggest bottleneck to that entire process. But currently right now, where we've been focusing is mostly on the design process and mostly on the site selection process prior to that. There's an awful lot more that we can do in terms of being able to bring together the rest of the data that ultimately winds up being part of that entire approval process and helping to smooth down those transitions of where paperwork, where processes change hands, where data ultimately winds up getting lost in the process. And those are the areas that currently we see the most value of being able to focus on in this particular part of the cycle. So that's the area that we're currently focusing on.
That's the right angle, at least from speaking to EPCs and project developers as well. That's something that keeps coming back, right? That everybody wants to work in one continuous workflow where you don't lose data between the connections, and and most companies are still using at least 5+ tools only in the solar design domain, right? So especially when we look at the yield simulation with PVsys, it's still kind of a monopoly, and you guys have your own yield model as well, and there are a couple of other nice tools as well, Plant Predictor as well, and it's interesting that the banks are so archaic that they are still stuck with that solution, and that's what they recognize, right?
I agree. I think this is an area, we did our own in-house research study last year amongst 400+ industry professionals. And one of the things we were talking about is like, what does the tool set look like that you guys are working through, and how many different tools? So you mentioned 5. I think we heard like it could be anywhere between 6 and 10, maybe as high as 12 in some cases, just the different places. And that's like also depending on the size of your organization and how the organization is structured, and whether you're a pure EPC or you're a pure developer versus, you do some EPC work, you're also a developer, you're also an asset owner and an IPP. Like, it becomes really, really messy. And the internal loss of control of your data is like pretty amazing, especially considering that it's like an internal organization. Then you start dealing with, when you're dealing with an EPC that's external to a solar developer, and that EPC might be using a different engineering firm to be able to do things like ground grading. Keeping track of everything is a real nightmare. And it's one of the biggest problems that our customers continue to talk to us about. It's one of the things that kind of think really slows things down and causes a lot of duplication of efforts. That ultimately is an area where we think we can ultimately continue to be able to drive additional efficiencies within our customers. And I think at the end of the day, that's ultimately where the most value can be gotten over the next couple of years for our existing customers and continuing to work with us.
True. And yeah, the data loss is one thing. And then, of course, we can go a little bit broader with the scope covered, right? So we mentioned the site selection, we mentioned the design. So you guys also do quite a lot on the civil side as well. Is there any ambition to look into more of the O&M part of the process as well after commissioning, or?
Yeah, I think that's that is definitely on the roadmap. In terms of the timing of doing something in that space, I would say we haven't made any decisions on when we would look to move in that direction. But I think operation and maintenance, I mean, some of the players that are in that space, it's not been a very easy market to be in. As much as you would think that this is a great market, there's more and more assets going to be coming online. It's one of the areas where, companies in that area continue to struggle. And I think what I'm afraid of in that market is that it just becomes a race to the bottom, right? And I think this is an area also where I think that, with all of the new cool things that are happening with AI, I don't know how much of a moat you can realistically create in that space when things like Claude or any of these other things can pull data together so quickly, so efficiently, build such cool dashboards and things like that, that I think there'll be some new players in the market that I think will be able to do fairly well for a period of time. But the longer term on this, I'm not sure how protected you can realistically be when AI is going to be able to do so much with well-structured data. So the question will become realistically is, does the solar industry or the energy industry people have the propensity to be able to structure their data well enough that they could utilize AI tools themselves in order to be able to replicate some of the monitoring platforms in the O&M space? I'm super excited about what AI has the capabilities to ultimately be able to do in the future, but this is an area where I do have some caution in terms of, how disruptive this area might ultimately get.
If you want my opinion on this, I think the biggest value add will happen when you will be able to truly translate the physical world into digital. and that's the part where AI can't help you, and that's going to be really, really difficult to do.
Agreed. But that's also one of the areas that I think most of the players in the current market also don't have that capability currently today. I do think that that's an area that I think we would have a pretty good opportunity.
Speaking of different players and perhaps acquisitions and one company purchasing the other one, what do you see in the market? Do you also have this sense of basically the bigger players are acquiring the smaller ones, and it's getting a little bit more concentrated because, of course, we are still in a slightly downturn economically, right?
So, I mean, are you talking about in the software side of this business or in the customer side of the business? Because what is it? Nextera and Dominion just signed a deal 2 days ago, or 2 days ago or yesterday. Can't even keep track at this point. Maybe it was just yesterday.
Yeah, but maybe let's dig into both.
I think that the market is ripe for consolidation right now. I really think that it is. So, and I think that that's actually on both sides. I think that in terms of like our customers, the bigger energy players, I think there's a lot of pipeline that can ultimately be purchased through M&A, and I think that that's ultimately happening. I think that's kind of one of the things that we're going to see more of in the U.S. over the next 6 to 12 months. And I think that on the software side of things, when we see a market downturn like this, I think it makes customers more cautious about their purchases. I think one of the things we hear from our customers is that they go through an awful lot of hoops. Some of our bigger enterprise customers, they have a lot of internal processes that they have to go through in order to be able to make software acquisition costs. And for them, it would be much easier for them if they could buy more through a single vendor. And I think that that's what we continue to hear. And so, where we see possibilities we're entertaining ideas to be able to make acquisitions that are, in areas that are not specifically in the design space, but in areas where our customers would be looking to be able to purchase additional services or additional software to be able to do other parts of the work that they do outside of the design piece. I won't share any of those specific areas right now.
Yeah, you don't need to disclose anything prematurely, but you mentioned a couple of things here. I want to zoom in on as well. So when it comes to pipelines, this is something that keeps coming back every single week and month this year. So I was just at the solar conference here in Brussels, the Solar Power Summit 2 weeks ago, and we had an analyst from the International Energy Agency discussing pipelines and flexibility. And basically she said that we have over 400 gigawatts of renewables in Europe stuck in the pipeline. So basically, these are projects that could technically be connected tomorrow, but because we can't, permit them, it's impossible to get to. So again, it comes back to the same thing, right?
I mean, it totally does. And I guess if you're thinking about from an M&A perspective, and if you're looking at buying additional pipeline from another developer, I think there's going to have to be some sort of like discount on this at this particular point, right? Because there's no way to know at this point when anything is going to ultimately come up. And I think that if I were looking at this business as an investor, looking for projects that are closer to being ready, that already have any sort of permitting approval, those are the only types of projects that I would be thinking about buying or investing in, because the days of speculative solar development where, you kind of do the first couple of stages of this and then you flip projects, I think those days are over. I don't see where that is something that most companies would be comfortable buying any sort of portfolio of projects like that in today's kind of market. They're just locking up capital for too long.
Speaking of markets and targets, do you see the market shifting anytime soon in the foreseeable future?
I mean, I think the only hope that we have for anything shifting in the near term is with more batteries coming online faster. I think that's the only way we can ultimately be able to accelerate at this particular point in time. The problem isn't being able to design more projects. It's being able to get more projects that are currently designed and waiting for approval approved. And I don't think that there are some countries that are making the investments in their grid infrastructure now that could to be able to ultimately help support the injection of more solar energy, but it's not going to be enough to help us be able to hit that without the assistance of battery storage in any way, shape, or form. I think it's really incredible the speed with which batteries have taken hold, and with the speed with which we're developing standalone battery storage projects. I think it would be great if we saw more battery storage being tied to already existing solar projects. I think that's an area where I think we could ultimately wind up seeing some real significant improvement. Those solar projects are already there. They're already existing. Let's level out what it is that they're ultimately injecting by using those batteries. I think that will be a huge, huge way forward. But until we have some form of, stabilization, I like the internal maths of the grid. I don't see being able to support that initiative as it currently stands today.
True, and what also keeps coming back is sometimes even people mention that BESS itself might not be enough either on its own, but we need to also think about more flexible generation. So you see this, in a kind of non-traditional tracker markets, right? Like Germany, the negative pricing during the midday, and then everybody's installing more and more trackers as well, which wasn't the case a few years back. And the market is really shifting, like on one side, the flexible consumption, the other side, flexible generation as well. And that's not really easy to do from one day to the other.
I think it's also really difficult to model out financially when you don't know what the market is going to ultimately look like in a year or two. How do you make those kind of decisions today? I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have.
We often forget about in the solar or renewables is that as long as the maths add up, everything will move with it. But we can talk about policy, we can talk about ideology behind it, but if the financial incentives line up, then everything is going to accelerate much faster.
I agree. I think that they do, as long as it's also like with the appropriate level of risk. And I think that government policy is one of the things that's making that assessment of risk really complicated at this point, because, the smallest change in policy can ultimately wind up drastically impacting timelines. Which ultimately then have significant changes in your return on investment, your IRR calculations. And I think this is the area that, if the European Union, if the world really wants to hit these renewable energy targets, like they really need to look internally to be able to figure out what they need to do in order to be able to start being able to move faster on the approval processes, on the permitting processes, and being able to get these things approved and moving through the pipeline faster. Because otherwise there's no way it's going to happen.
So when it comes to, all the hardware components that are part of the whole solar process itself, we have some new regulations coming out soon, at least here on the European side, but in the US it's already there, that you won't be able to use, certain hardware to your projects, etc. It also makes that complexity a bit more harder as well. And do you guys have any sort of methodology behind which components to integrate in the design software, so it makes it easier for engineers to model those?
I mean, so the way our software is currently set up, it's very agnostic. So the users actually are able to establish the presets that they are going to ultimately wind up using. Now we're moving forward in the near future with being able to introduce some of a component library where we'll have the ability to be able to make a choice of a particular inverter, a particular structure, particular modules, and that's there primarily to be able to help ease the design process. It's not necessarily to make those kinds of recommendations. I think one of the things that we've learned from, working with so many customers is that for the most part, they're not going to choose from, 15 different manufacturers. They already have agreements in most places with a couple, and so they know already which ones it is that they're going to ultimately be working with. But one of the things we're hearing more and more is from actual OEMs that are interested when they come out with new technology. how can PVcase help us get in front of more customers to help be able to show them the differences in how our product works as compared to somebody else's, and how can we help be able to set them up to be able to do these types of comparisons between new technology and old technology and help to be able to tell that story better. So this is something that we're currently we're currently working on internally with our partnerships team in order to be able to help evaluate how we could come together with a solution that would give customers the ability to be able to highlight those differences and run multiple simulations comparing different pieces together simultaneously through the selection of those through our component library.
Okay, and when it comes to the technical solutions that are coming out, do you guys have a strategy or a mantra that based on which you would choose certain partnerships, or is it more like customer driven, that this is the feedback that we are receiving from our customers and we would look into integrating X or Y component into the software itself?
I mean, I would start by saying that, we're customer first always. So, we are very actively engaged with all of our customers through support, through quarterly business reviews. And so we're typically prioritizing what we hear from customers first. Most of the time, what we're hearing from customers is also what we're hearing with our in-house, solar expertise in terms of everybody on the team is pretty tied into exactly what's going on, what the new technologies are. In terms of how we go about selecting any sort of partners, that is something that is typically most of the partners that we currently work with are also customers, right? So, we have a pretty good spread within the OEM section of the market where they use the product internally in order to help support mutual customers. And so those are the ones that we currently, think about prioritizing first in this.
How do you guys view AI from a product or a company's perspective? Is it a friend or a foe?
I think it's both. I think that it's a friend in that I think that AI will have a use case in this industry one way or another, that's for sure. Where I continue to, be tied in to conversations with not just in solar, but in just engineering as a whole. When you're talking about infrastructure projects, when you're talking about bridge design, building design, things along those lines, I think there's a certain level of mistrust of what AI will be capable of ultimately doing. And if I think about its systems in the US as an example, in the US, to be able to get a project approved, an engineer has to basically put a stamp of approval on it, which is kind of like they're saying that this is a good design, this is a good project, right? And I do think that there is a certain level of, I don't know that we're going to necessarily build this thing just based on what a computer artificial intelligence told us to do versus, having the experience of a person that has been through this process many, many, many times in order to be able to ultimately give the stamp of approval on that. And so that's an area where I think that there's a balance between friend and foe in this particular space. But I think we're in a very interesting time.
That answer is also changing every single day, right? So if you look at it, what the AI is capable of today, yes, you need the final human stamp of approval. Did you need it in 1 year time from today? It's questionable.
I think to know whether or not a project, if you think about the training of an LLM, right, then you really need to be able to have the full feedback loop. Here's the way a project was designed. Here's the way it was built. Here's the full history. Here's the way it now operates. And based on that feeds back into the design process and tells you how to better design the next project. And that learning process will take a while. And I don't know that we currently have all of that life cycle currently connected in a way in which you can actually go through that process and train it out so far. Will we have that in a year? I don't know if we'll have that in a year to the point where we'll be able to train an LLM in order to be able to do that to the degree of certainty that you would want. In 5 years, probably.
Actually, we are reaching the end of our time. Is there perhaps any exciting announcement that we can tease about?
The next big thing we have coming up, of course, is everybody's favorite solar event of the year, which is Intersolar and Messe Munich. So we'll be there, of course, attending that event. So, everyone should feel free to come on by and see us at the booth. Would love to see everybody there. But in terms of like anything that we currently have in the works for the product, we're working on several initiatives internally at this point, which will, be sharing more as they become available over the next 3 to 6 month period of time, as we lead up into RE Plus coming in the US.
We are trying to do this tradition of the previous guest leaving a question for the follow-up guests. What question would you leave to the next guest?
What do you think it will take to get governments to fix their permitting and approval process?
Thank you very much for being here. We finally made this happen.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
And I guess we will see each other in Munich.
I will certainly be there. Stop by the booth. Come and check us out. I believe we're going to be at booth A3180 and A3179. So come check us out.
Definitely.